So what are some things then that natural selection can't do?
Well, remember, again, going back to the definition of reproduction of the fittest, it means natural selection can't explain the all-important topic of origin of first life, when life is what can reproduce. Natural selection can't explain the origin of the first self-reproducing cell, because you have to have the reproduction before you can even talk about natural selection. So the idea of life from non-living chemicals, which is called chemical evolution, natural selection cannot help there. Okay, that's one thing. The other thing is, as I said, it's a culling force. It works in the fallen world by removing things and not by adding things. So for evolution to work, to go from, say, bacteria to biologists, you have to have new genes and new information to add the information, to make it go uphill. But natural selection is removing things and not adding things. So in fact, it's the reverse of what evolution needs. And the other thing is, natural selection doesn't create the fit. It only selects from what's already there. So you might say that natural selection is survival of the fittest, but doesn't explain the arrival of the fittest.
Okay, so that's an important distinction to make there. So it's always a loss of information. Do I understand correctly?
Yeah, it's always removing stuff from the population, not adding stuff. Okay, and there are plenty of examples of that going on. In fact, when you do artificial selection, you're trying to get a purebred dog, you're trying to remove the stuff you don't want. If you want to make a big dog, you want to remove the genes for the smallness. If you want a hairy dog that survives in the cold, you'll remove the dogs that don't have much hair. Okay, and this would happen in nature too. If the ice age happens, the animals which are very well protected by furry coats are the ones who will survive and leave offspring that survive. The ones that don't have furry coats are going to be killed by the cold and not survive. But that's natural or artificial selection. It's removing the things that don't work for the environment.
So in that process, it almost sounds like natural selection, that there's a choice being consciously made. Is that the case?
Well, I mean, that's one of the objections that some in the creation movement have said. I think it's a misguided objection. And it's ironic that, in fact, some opponents of Darwin made the same objection to Darwin. And Alfred Russel Wallace, who basically co-discovered the concept with Darwin, he wrote to Darwin and said, well, people are misunderstanding you by saying selection means consciousness. And Darwin agreed, and he said, well, the term is there, and I actually prefer Herbert Spencer's term, survival of the fittest. But he said, but also, we often use terms non-literally in science. He talked about affinity, chemical affinities. Obviously, the chemicals don't have any actual affinity in the literal meaning, but it's a common term. Light-sensitive medicine doesn't mean the medicine actually is consciously sensitive. It means you don't store it in light. You store it in a dark place. Chemists like me, we talk about hydrophobic and hydrophilic chemicals, which literally mean water-fearing and water-loving. But we know the chemicals don't fear or love anything.
Right, that's just an expression.
It's expressions. And the same with Darwin, he never intended it to be used literally. And when you look at his successors, Dobzhansky, as I said, defined it as differential reproduction. Richard Dawkins, atheist, evolutionist, was very clear. Natural selection is a purposeless force, no foresight, like a blind watchmaker, just totally purposeless. So Darwin and his successors are very clear. It has nothing to do with conscious selection. And anyone who takes it that way is not really understanding what they meant.
Okay, so what would you say to a creationist who didn't want to use that term, that they had a problem with that term?
Well, if we don't use the term, it gives the impression that we have no answer for what's an observable phenomenon, that some things will reproduce more than other things. It's observable. Why we would want to give the impression that we can't answer it, when in fact creationists thought of it first, and Darwin hijacked natural selection to use it for his own ends of trying to show things could evolve from one kind into a different kind. But instead, what we should show is, we got it first, he hijacked it, and also is part of the biblical creation and fall model. So if it's evidence, if it's part of both models, the creation and the evolution model, it can't be used as evidence for one over the other.
Well, you've written about this and much more widely in your best-selling book, The Genesis account. And so we're going to make it available as an ebook with a 25% discount. Do you want to tell us just a little bit about this book?
Oh, sure. Okay, the 800-page commentary, Genesis 1 to 11, I actually go up to 12:3 to get the Abrahamic covenants in, okay. But it goes into the text of the Bible, hopefully fairly non-technical, a little bit of Hebrew explanation, but not really unless it's really necessary, that the days are ordinary days, that it's about 6,000 years ago, the creation, I do all that sort of stuff. Also, I discussed some of the scientific issues arising. I mean, it's the only commentary that talks about dinosaurs and the Ice Age, design of creation, some moral issues like the beginning of human life or the overpopulation myth, but then how all the doctrines of Christianity have their beginnings in these early chapters of Genesis. And then I want to look at how the apostles, and in fact how Jesus understood Genesis, because if we're Christians, shouldn't we have the same view of Genesis as Jesus himself had?
Well, this sounds like an excellent resource. And again, we're going to have a 25% discount on the ebook, and the link is in the description. Thank you, Dr. Sarfati.
Well, thank you, Dawn.